Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Russian gold. Moscow's buying up the yellow metal in record amounts. But why? Is gold a geopolitical financial weapon? Or are sanctions really forcing President Putin to dump his foreign currency? And don't forget what's behind those sanctions, Ukraine. We uncover the daily reality amidst conflict and economic hardships. And we talk to Bill Browder, once the biggest investor in Russia. Now he's a critic of President Putin and has put it all in print. And animal poaching, the big illicit business that's been tamed in Nepal, but why Zimbabwe and South Africa are actually selling wildlife to try to combat it. You know, we've told the story of Russia's failing economy many times over on this program. And we're going to do it again, but this week it is from a very different perspective. Gold. It's not usually part of the Russia narrative, and central banks buying and selling the stuff isn't anything unusual. But right now, Russia is spending more on gold than at any time since the breakup of the Soviet Union. In fact, over the past year, Moscow has spent more than $7 billion on gold. That now means its total gold holdings are worth $49 billion. Break it down a bit further. Last month, Russia bought almost 21 tons of gold. That means it now has, well, it's 1,208 tons, which makes it the fifth biggest holder of gold in the world. For the record, it's the United States which has the most, with almost 8 times that amount. But at the same time, Russia's currency reserves have shrunk by more than $100 billion. We're now down to $376 billion as it defends the ruble's rout. But it's the timing of this gold buy-up which has got us interested. See, Russia is a nation in recession. Its economy is under Western sanctions, and its biggest export, oil, is under pressure, and of course that's priced in US dollars. So could President Vladimir Putin be pushing back through this gold shopping spree? He's railed against the dominance of the dollar. He's dumped some of the country's holdings of US government debt. It's all been termed as a kind of financial weaponization. Now, we'll pick up on the gold issue again in our interview with Bill Browder a little later, but we also want to introduce the other issue in the region, and that is, of course, Ukraine. Because Russia's presence there has brought Western sanctions onto the country, and it's also pushed Ukraine to the brink of bankruptcy and into an IMF-led $40 billion bailout. We've got 2 reports from Paul Brennan now explaining the very scale of Ukraine's economic challenge.
From central Kiev's high-end retailers to this street market in the suburbs is less than 10 kilometers, but it may as well be 10,000. A woman samples a bottle top of milk to test for freshness. Every spending decision here is carefully pondered. As inflation erodes their already meager income, every last kopika of cash is precious.
Definitely yes. Everything has become more expensive. Utilities, food, everything. The wages are the same, but everything else is more expensive.
12-month inflation to the end of December was 24.9%. Ukraine's GDP dropped by 7% in 2014. And the currency, the hryvnia, is worth 15 to the US dollar, just half of what it was a year ago. Before being ousted a year ago, President Yanukovych enjoyed extraordinary opulence. Yanukovych's former estate here at Mezhygiria outside Kiev epitomizes the worst excesses of the former regime. But economic recovery here in Ukraine depends not just on ousting a president and removing a few corrupt officials. It needs cultural and systemic reform. Economic and political reform is underway, driven by young, dynamic people brought in from the business world. One of them is Dmytro Shimkiv, an entrepreneur and former Microsoft executive. Among his tasks, to balance the spending cuts demanded by the IMF with the need to recruit and retain good people.
If we expect the civil servants to know foreign language, to work with the lawyers, to be able to draft them, to work with the contemporary technology, communicate with contemporary technology, be able to run negotiations, etc., and that person's going to earn $50, well, per month, that's not going to fly.
Mining runs deep in East Ukraine, deep in the ground and deep in the psyche of the people here. The coal that these men will dig 1,000 meters down powers the region's huge steel plants, generates electricity and heats people's homes. Donetsk and Lugansk supply 95% of Ukraine's coal and 16% of the country's GDP. Now, these miners just feel lucky to still have jobs.
This mine is our home and our work. If there is no work, it would mean no money and no means to feed the family.
Last autumn, when grads started landing within the perimeter fence of this mine, it actually had to close for 6 weeks. It was simply too dangerous to operate. And you can hear the conflict is still literally on the doorstep.
We're hoping the conflict ends. We want the economic situation to improve as soon as possible, so this mine can work for 10 or 12 years, or maybe even more.
The conflict has meant industrial production in Donetsk has fallen 60% year on year, and in Lugansk it fell by 85%. Meanwhile, Ukraine's government is spending $10 million a day on the military campaign in the east. The former separatist stronghold of Slavyansk was recaptured by Ukrainian soldiers last July. The government in Kiev is now providing $24 million to subsidize the city's finances and support reconstruction.
There are between 10 and 15,000 people who fled the conflict zone and who have settled in Slavyansk. Obviously, that is a burden on our infrastructure. The new arrivals need work, food and accommodation. So we are hoping for the support of the international community, such as the EU.
At least this ATM still has cash to dispense. Over in the separatist-held areas, the banking system has completely collapsed. Pensions have not been paid for months. In Slavyansk, shops have reopened, but few have money to spend.
For instance, my mother stays in Mariupol because she cannot find work here. When I came back here, I was lucky to get my old job back. But my boyfriend is unemployed. Before the war, there was not much work available. Now there are no jobs at all.
So let's bring together Ukraine, Russia, the latter's gold buying spree, all these economic challenges with our guest in London. He is Bill Browder, the founder of Hermitage Capital, which at one time was the biggest investor in Russia, and we're going to talk about that a little later. Bill, first of all this ruble trouble and economic trouble and oil trouble, and yet Russia's buying up all this gold. Can you give us the short story as to why, at least in your mind, he's doing this?
Well, Putin has basically made a policy for Russia to be anti-West, and so what that means is basically he doesn't want to have dollars because that in some way shows his support for America. So instead, he's buying gold. I don't think he's making an economic or a market decision. I think he's just making a political decision, which is not to own dollars.
And does the West actually care about any of this?
I don't think anyone particularly cares, other than a few people who are buying and selling gold. At the end of the day, Russia is a marginal player in terms of gold and in terms of currency markets, and so I don't think it makes that much of a difference.
Okay, then. So how does all of this play into the bigger game here? You know, we sort of look at Vladimir Putin, we wonder, is he playing the long game here? Is he making it up as he goes along? What's your assessment on the way in which Mr. Putin is fighting back against the West and against the sanctions?
Well, basically, in my mind, the whole purpose of his invasion in Ukraine is to distract the Russian people from his kleptocracy inside Russia. And therefore, he's got to keep on going in Ukraine. He's got to keep on he's sort of stirring up a nationalist frenzy, and so he's going to carry on with Ukraine. I think he's probably going to carry on by doing invasions in other countries. I think Moldova, Georgia, and possibly even the Baltics will eventually be at risk. What that means is that sanctions won't be lifted in the future. And what that means is the Russian economy and the ruble will continue to be under pressure. And eventually, I believe that they'll impose currency controls and capital controls in Russia, because I don't see how, with people wanting to take all of their rubles out and getting dollars, they'll be able to continue to supply dollars to people without running out of reserves.
So you say basically that he's sort of running distraction and he's stirring up nationalist fervor. But if you're a Russian who doesn't have a job and who has money problems and is seeing their savings eroded, surely you can't be distracted from those things for too long as a Russian person.
That's true, and the reality is, and Putin's never dealt with this reality before. He's always been what I would describe as sort of the good economic president. He came in after Yeltsin's chaos of the 1990s, and so for the first 8 years of Putin's reign, people were getting better off and sort of feeling good about themselves. And so this is uncharted territory for him. He can survive in a sort of system that was quasi-democratic before, when people were better off, but now that they're worse off, he has to only survive in a repressive system where democracy doesn't exist. And so what you'll see is that any political challenge coming from anywhere will be squashed out immediately with arrests and repression, because you're right, he can't deal with people who are unemployed and hungry.
Now, Bill, in the past on Counting the Cost, we've spoken about your experiences in Russia. Now, I don't want to be acting as your book agent here, but you have written a book about all of this. The kind of sort of, gripping tale which, well, it's not a tale, is it? I mean, remind our viewers what happened to you.
Well, I've got a book out. It's called Red Notice, How I Became Putin's #1 Enemy. And it describes my, my time in Russia as the largest foreign investor. It describes how, after uncovering corruption, I was expelled from the country, declared a threat to national security, how my offices were raided. My young lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was arrested, tortured for 358 days, and then murdered in police custody 5 years ago. And then it finishes up by discussing how I've gone on to fight for justice by getting sanctions against the people who killed him and other Russian human rights violators. It's a gripping story, it's a sad story, and it's a story that I want to make sure is told around the world.
And the slight irony, too, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Vladimir Putin actually ended up using your research to go after the Russian oligarchs. Is that right?
Indeed. So when we were doing our anti-corruption work, I was a shareholder activist in Russia for many years as the largest investor. We would put out really detailed descriptions of how the Russian oligarchs were stealing from the companies. And Vladimir Putin used that research to go and fire them, to issue presidential decrees to stop the stealing. That all worked for a while until Putin arrested the richest oligarch, Michael Hordakovsky, the owner of Yukos, put him in jail. And all the rest of the oligarchs said, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in jail like him? And Putin said something to the effect of 50%. And so Putin went on to become the biggest oligarch in Russia, and my interests then spectacularly diverged from his.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, isn't it? Bill Browder, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time today. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, animal poaching, the supply, the demand, the extraordinary illegal trade, and how countries are trying to fight back. That's still to come. Right now, though, we turn to Bangladesh, where unfortunately the trade in human organs is big business. Each year, hundreds of people put their body parts up for sale in an underground organ bazaar. Mahar Sattar has that story.
In the end, for all his troubles, Mehdi Hassan didn't even get to save a life. The man he gave part of his liver to died only 3 months after the operation. As for Mehdi, he says he received less than half of the $5,000 he was promised by organ traffickers.
The doctors and nurses at the hospital saw the clothes I was wearing. They saw the way I behaved. And they knew that I wasn't part of the patient's family. They saw the food I would request to eat, and they knew immediately I was from the village, that I had been bought my money.
Mehdi is from Joypurhat district, a hub for organ traffickers. At least 120 people from his locality have sold a part of their livers or one of their kidneys. Potato farming is the primary source of income in this area, but it's not a big earner. The farmers here say they earn about $200 from a 3-month harvest, and that barely covers their costs. That's a key reason why the people in this part of the country are so easily tempted by the promises of organ traffickers. Police recently cracked down on a network of organ traders here. Razaul was one of those arrested.
The police filed a case against me saying I'm a trafficker. I said I don't know anything about trafficking. I don't know anything about it. I don't know why they are saying I am one.
Many of the traffickers are people who are also victims. After their operations, some of them become local contacts for the brokers. Shaharul sold one of his kidneys in 2009. 3 other members of his family eventually did the same. Shaharul denies he had anything to do with their decision, although police say otherwise.
People are making close to $5,000 for their organs, and it's making the people here greedy. You'll even find people here who have plenty of land and income, and still they'll come up to you and say, "Hey, do you know how I can sell my kidney?"
Mehdi says he can't do any more manual labor because he has a hernia. It's a common post-transplant complication. He'll need another operation, but he doesn't know who's going to pay for it.
And from human trade to animal trade, poaching in fact. You know, South Africa's been forced to actually sell some of its wildlife. It's moved around 100 rhino to neighbouring countries and into private reserves just to protect them from poachers. And with good reason. The illegal wildlife trade is estimated to be worth around $150 billion a year, so says the United Nations Environment Programme. Rhino horn is actually more valuable than gold and platinum. A kilo of the stuff can cost $65,000. It's popular in Asia, where it's used in some medicines. It has a legal market too. South Africa, for example, has 25 tonnes of rhino horn from animals that die naturally and from legal hunts. It's valued at $1.6 billion. Over the border in Zimbabwe, there's something similar going on. Endangered elephants are being rounded up to be sold overseas. Of course, Zimbabwe's had money problems for years, leaving, among other things, its national parks deprived of cash. So selling the elephants could provide the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Authority with much-needed resources to pay for roads and water. But we've also got the story of Nepal, which is actually a good case study of a country that's had some success in tackling the poaching problem. Sabina Shrestha has this from Kathmandu.
Up until a decade ago, these forests were the hunting grounds for wildlife poachers. Greater one-horned rhinos were killed regularly, and by the year 2005, only 372 remained in Nepal. The king of the jungle, the Royal Bengal tiger, was hunted down to a mere 95 2 decades ago. But today there are over 198 tigers and 534 rhinos, and Nepal has become the only country to achieve zero poaching. More than 7,000 soldiers patrol these forests.
We make a point that boots on the ground, which is very, very important in our case. Therefore, most of the time our troops are patrolling the area. We even go by foot patrolling, boat patrolling, even cycle patrolling, which has been very, very, very effective.
While the soldiers are visible behind the scenes, the Central Investigation Bureau of Nepal Police has been active. They say that the arrest of a number of kingpins in the past few years has made wildlife traders cautious to operate in Nepal.
Ours is a unique team, both nationally and internationally. The commitment from army chiefs and battalion commanders and Nepal Police's Central Investigation Bureau in curbing wildlife crime has been exceptional. The government recently decided to double the amount to spend on habitat conservation and anti-poaching mechanisms.
In the past, not only was enforcement weak, Nepal was also an important smuggling route for wildlife parts between India and China, where there is high demand for traditional medicines based on animal parts.
Unless we bring the concerned government into this business, then whatever effort we put in like controlling poaching, that doesn't work. In 2010, we were able to have a MOU between government of China and government of Nepal, how to address wildlife crimes that exist at the border areas.
But despite their successes, the authorities say they must remain vigilant because the demand for animal parts is still strong and prices are high.
Right, so we're going to discuss some of those issues now with the chairman of the Private Rhino Owners Association in South Africa. Pelham Jones is in our Johannesburg studio. Pelham, kind of a broad question to start with, but why is there still such a problem of rhino poaching in South Africa? What is, to your mind, the issue which really drives it?
Well, it's a situation of an illegal demand, and the approach towards South Africa has been coming a long time. We have seen how African countries to the north of us have been plagued by poaching because of this very, very strong illegal demand for a product which is sought after in the Far East. So we have over time seen large populations, and we estimate some over 100,000 rhino have been poached across the face of Africa, from Kenya coming right down to Namibia, Swaziland, etc. So we were the last bastion of large rhino populations, and I think we were perceived by the criminals as being a tough target until they realized that they were in fact able to enter our reserves with a certain degree of impunity and have now subsequently killed some 4,000 rhinos since they started their slaughter in 2008.
You talked about, I guess, the external demand there for the rhino horn. Tell me about the internal problems. You know, the parks, the rangers, are they outgunned? Are they outnumbered? Are they well equipped enough? What are the internal issues that you think South Africa faces here?
Well, again, if you look back to 2008, which was really when the onslaught, or I refer to the tsunami, began, we were, I think, caught with our pants down. We did not anticipate the level of onslaught, the intensity of it, nor the aggression. Certainly since then, we have played catch-up. Our anti-poaching units are operating on paramilitary basis. We are utilizing some of the most sophisticated military technology available today, a lot of equipment that's been used in some of the war zones. We are applying that, but sadly the sheer quantum and the vast areas of remote wilderness that are required to be protected, we do not have the ability to stop them. So in other words, in summary, more of the same technology is not working. We saw, despite hundreds of millions of dollars being spent in anti-poaching operations, Kenya, Tanzania, and so it carries on. Sadly, it has not stopped the slaughter. So we are saying that we have to look at a change in strategy.
One solution I've read about here is the idea, and we talked about it before, of selling rhinos to overseas buyers and to private safari parks who are perhaps better equipped to deal with the issue of protection. Is that a solution, or is that more of a stopgap measure?
Legalized trade is not the single fix-it solution. It is a possibility to be considered, but to be applied in conjunction with a number of other activities. For example, education amongst the consumer communities of the Far East, better law enforcement, better political intervention, and so it carries on. If one analyzes, so what is this onslaught costing us? Our calculations are that it is running at some 1.4 billion rands a year. That is what it is costing state reserves, provincial reserves, as well as private reserves. Now, the private reserves have to bear these expenses independently. Now, we own some 25%, 27% of the national population. That's in excess of 5,000 rhino. Now, we are not getting any level of assistance from any quarter. So the net result is that many reserves have now lost their rhino populations, or the owners have simply thrown in the towel.
Just a quick final thought from you, Pelham, about the levels of, and you've mentioned this a little bit, but I want a little bit more detail now, about the funding for national parks and for anti-poaching schemes. I'm talking government funding here. Is there enough interest in funding this to actually make a difference?
Well, in terms of the situation within South Africa, there has been incredible assistance from members of society, corporates, etc. But sadly, it comes nowhere near to the current operating expense of some 1.4 billion rand. We certainly would look to assistance from foreign nationals, foreign corporations to assist in this conservation onslaught, because in many areas we do not have enough manpower, we do not have enough boots in the veld, as we refer to, and we are quite severely under-resourced. And this, of course, is playing into the advantage of the poachers, who have a high degree of sophistication. They've got good communication abilities, they have good getaway abilities, and they've good intelligence capabilities. So from our side, we are under-resourced from a policing point, and we are under-resourced in terms of a field protection aspect.
Pelham Joan, very interesting to get your thoughts on this issue. Thank you for joining us today. And that right there was our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page with individual reports, links and entire episodes to catch up on. And you can also get in touch with us by tweeting either me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag as well, that is AJCTC, or just drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.